The 1990s, man, what a fun time for television. Okay, this dark orange does not look good. Just give me a second. Yeah, that looks good. Anyway, television. When most Westerners think of Japanese TV, three things typically come to mind: crazy game shows, weird ads, and sketch comedy. And many of the most famous clips in these categories come from the 90s. The comedy sketches in particular were often clips from variety shows, and in the mid-90s no variety shows were as widely known as those starring legendary comedy duo Downtown, consisting of Masatoshi Hamada and Hitoshi Matsumoto. And it just so happened that Matsumoto was a gamer. In late 1996, Japan experienced a second, smaller Tetris boom after the release of Mini Tetlin, a small and very cheap keychain device containing a bootleg version of Tetris, ideal for everyday people who didn't typically play video games. Riding on this boom, Matsumoto decided to develop a two-part segment for the show Downtown no Gotsue Kanji, titled The Road to the Tetris King of the Entertainment World. Matsumoto's original plan for the segment involved dubbing himself the King of Tetris and challenging various other celebrities in a competitive Tetris game, specifically Super Tetris 3. However, his Tetris skill turned out to be average at best, so the segment was revised to see how many of the recurring cast members he could beat in a series of versus matches. The segment was aired across 2 episodes in November 1996, both with prime-time slots that would further push the Tetris boom. Meanwhile, a group of former Capcom employees headed by game designer Akira Nishitani had recently formed the foundation of a new game company named Arika, which is just Akira's name in reverse. By the late 90s, however, Arika's most widely known member, by a mile, was the company's enigmatic vice president, Ichiro Mihara. After the success of Arika's first project, the spin-off game Street Fighter EX, Mihara was given the opportunity to create and lead a game of his choosing. He had recently seen the Gotsue Kanji Tetris segment on TV, and was inspired to try making his own competitive Tetris game for home consoles. His plan was simple: design a Gotsu-themed Tetris game focused on competitive battles, and pitch it to Downtown and their parent company Yoshimoto. Mihara was planning for a dramatic visual style, supposedly involving 3D environments but with 2D characters, a similar style to the recently released PlayStation game Parappa the Rapper. But when pitch day eventually rolled around in 1997, Matsumoto gave the advice that would save the idea from mediocrity. The fun of Tetris comes from its simplicity. So Mihara worked on scaling back the flourishes, but by September another issue had arisen. Matsumoto's simmering frustration with Fuji TV, the TV network airing Gotsue Kanji, reached a boiling point after they decided on short notice to delay the show's date-sensitive 2-hour special in order to air a Central League Baseball Championship game. This event, and the subsequent falling out between Matsumoto and Fuji TV, led to the show's sudden cancellation in October. With no show to design his game for, and no other plan to differentiate it, Mihara had no choice but to shelve the project for the time being. Oh, that wasn't actually that long. After half a year away from Tetris, a wave of motivation had struck, and a new plan was beginning to form. This time it would be an arcade release, and it would build on Sega's Tetris, a game Mihara was familiar with as an avid arcade player. He was pretty confident it could be improved upon, so he assembled a crack team of around a dozen people to help develop his vision. This team included Sega Tetris superstar TJ, one of the players from the famous tape a decade prior, who also previously did playtesting for Flashpoint and Block Seed. Mihara believed he could design a version of Tetris more focused on skill and speed than Sega's version, yet also more smooth and intuitive. As an example, sometime during development, a woman from the Arika office was doing a test play and was confused when the piece wouldn't rotate while up against the wall. Being accustomed to Sega's methods, Mihara was hesitant to change the existing rotation system, but he decided to ask the development team to try designing a system that would allow for rotations against the walls. Thus, the kick system was born. If a piece couldn't rotate, the game would kick it 1 block to the right and try again, and if that failed, it would try kicking the piece to the left. Only if all 3 checks failed would the piece not rotate. This meant that if a piece tried to rotate up against the left wall, it could kick right, and up against the right wall, it could kick left. This was a crucial improvement for beginner players, as it made rotation far more intuitive and allowed them to throw pieces against the wall without having to worry about flicking it back in order to rotate it. On top of this, it also greatly increased maneuverability at the higher speeds. Since the kick system didn't seem to cause any critical gameplay issues, it was agreed to add into the game fully. But the big question here is, how do you balance so many things? Can you manage a Tetris game that's smooth and intuitive, that draws in new players, then forges them into masters, that retains its competitive aspects, all without sacrificing simplicity? Maybe it was game dev mastery, maybe it was just luck, but yes, it was possible. Arika had just spearheaded a brand new style for a game series long thought stagnant. The game was called Tetris the Grand Master, and it was about to push the arcade community's abilities to the limit. From a game design standpoint, TGM resembles Sega's Tetris only at a surface level. It has the same fast left-right movement, the same fast soft drop, and the same lock delay. There are, however, some standout changes. The level system has been drastically changed, now increasing by 1 every time a piece drops, with additional increases when lines are cleared. There are also goals set every 100 levels, with each barrier requiring a line clear to continue through. You might have noticed the score is now attached to a grade indicating the player's skill level. This grade goes from 9 down to 1, then from S1 up to S9, with the best achieved grades appearing on the leaderboard. Getting good scores comes from things like Tetrises and combos, but improving your speed is now a major factor to the gameplay, as evidenced by the large omnipresent timer, and the fact that your final time appears on the leaderboard. Another nice new feature for more beginner players is what TGM calls the temporary landing system. That's this semi-transparent ghost piece that appears for the first 100 levels, which helps you see exactly where your piece will fall on the stack. TGM's visual style is certainly memorable. The game runs on the Sony ZN2, a PlayStation-based board used exclusively by Arika and Capcom for their early 3D fighting games. Arika likely chose it because it's what they were familiar with, but it's a hilariously overpowered board for this game, with its advanced 3D graphics capabilities used pretty much exclusively for the line clear animation and the spinning board effect. In fact, all the boards are actually 3D and simply rendered from the front, which results in this distracting 2-pixel column down the middle. The music and sound design are highlights of the game, produced by the talented Shinji Hosoe and Ayako Saso. The CD for the soundtrack eventually released in May of '99, and you'll never guess who directed it. 1998, the year of TGM's release, actually marked TJ's transition into the video game music industry, an industry he would work in for the next 20 years. Now, that's all well and good, but besides the new grades and visual polish, how is TGM so different from the versions of Tetris already in arcades? You've likely already made the connection, but the key is that Mihara had seen Shimizu's game, and its unique difficulty makes its grand debut in TGM once the player hits level 500. 20cell, now called 20G, is back in full force, although even just getting to level 500 is no easy feat. At 300 the speed jumps from 1 to 2G, and by 400 it hits 5G, a speed already beyond any previous official Tetris game. As we've seen, these speeds require very careful consideration of where you place your pieces and how to prevent them from getting jammed, but TGM offers a variety of mechanical changes to make it more viable. The new kick system is one of those things that helps massively, with some new moves that weren't possible under Sega's rotation system. The game also generously adds what it calls the initial rotation system, whereby holding a rotate button before a piece spawns you can make it rotate instantly, helping with maneuverability and potentially saving your pieces from getting stuck during 20G. Like the kick system, IRS also wasn't part of the original plan for the game. The idea started as a bug where the piece would rotate before falling in 20G only if you happened to press the button on the exact frame it spawned. But the development team realized it could be incorporated as a feature and it made gameplay a lot smoother. This is what I meant when I said the game's revolutionary changes might have just been luck. Finally, a mechanic that you may not have considered before now is the way the pieces are chosen. Most early versions of Tetris use, or at least approximate, completely random pieces. This comes with the obvious downside that you can occasionally go dozens of pieces without getting the one you want, or the opposite problem where you receive an unworkable piece multiple times in a row. Both very well known frustrations in games like NES Tetris.
Freaking Z-Spire, what were you doing?
Let's get put on there. I was messing around.
TGM remedies this by severely limiting the chance of obtaining a piece you've recently been dealt, thereby favouring pieces you haven't seen in a while. It is still possible to occasionally get droughts under the system, and the level of randomness a piece randomizer should have is a debatable topic, but I'm sure it'll all get agreed upon and won't be part of any major dramas down the line. Although TGM's 20G may be a lot more playable than its incipient iteration, simply surviving it isn't enough to get a great score. The game ends at level 999, giving you a limited number of lines to achieve the highest score you can. As it should be, if you want to be a Grand Master, you should have to be able to show your mastery, and that means playing consistently well at the highest speed the game can throw at you. Speaking of which, there is indeed a Grand Master grade, but its requirements aren't as simple as gaining a certain number of points. Achieving Grand Master requires hitting 3 milestone levels with both a certain number of points and under a certain time, and these requirements are a considerable challenge. This is another notable change from high-level Sega Tetris gameplay. You can no longer get away with pausing to think at the lower speeds, since the GM time requirements demand fast play the whole way through the game. This made becoming a Grand Master a daunting task, even for seasoned Sega Tetris players. Unsurprisingly, this also made it highly alluring. The competitive aspect originally intended for the game is not lost. A second player can join for a versus match with a variety of goofy effects, or simply play at the same time if versus mode is disabled. There are also a few other fun things. Clearing the board completely, now called a Bravo, awards quadruple the amount of points, some fireworks, and a special medal that displays on the leaderboard. The V-shaped challenge that so many Sega Tetris players were familiar with is now rewarded with a secret grade based on how high you can build it. Some hidden modes are also unlockable by inputting certain codes, such as a mode that starts you at 20G, and a big piece mode. I don't have an explanation for this one, but it's fun. The thing about Tetris skill is you'd think it translates very well between different versions of the game, but this is shockingly untrue. Beyond the transferable base skills of stacking cleaner and thinking faster, most of what separates top Tetris players is muscle memory for the specific game they're playing, obtainable only by years of practice. If you ask a modern player to try NES Tetris for example, they'll be good, but nowhere near close to the abilities of top NES players, even if they can think just as fast. Because of this, there aren't many people who are great at all types of Tetris variants. Most people only focus on one or a few specific games they enjoy. I say all of this because it's time to introduce the Hall of Champions. Our inaugural member for this hall is our favourite Sega Tetris World Champion, TJ. However, to spoil the ending, TJ will not be the greatest TGM player of all time. He was, as far as we know, the only person on the development team who could achieve GM. Even Mihara was rubbish. But TJ doesn't count because he helped playtest, so who will be the first proper Grandmaster? And how soon after the game's release will the rank first be achieved? As it turns out, they wouldn't have to wait long to find out. Very shortly after the game's release, likely on release day, a player by the name of Zon was recognized as the first Grandmaster. The details aren't really known, but it is known that Mihara had gifted Zon his own custom board as a reward for being first, and apparently it only took 30 games to get GM. Zon was an avid Sega Tetris player, and luckily the two games are similar enough that some of the skill carries over. His score and time from this game aren't recorded, but this is still a record worth noting, so I'm just going to place him at the highest possible time you can get a GM with. Once you have the GM rank, you can focus on getting a higher score, but the game's leaderboard orders GMs by time, so that's the generally accepted metric for comparison, and that's what this graph will be using. The first GM game with a time that is known is by TJ, who wasn't far below the limit himself. This is probably because the requirements for GM were set based on his skill as a playtester. I am including TJ's records on this list, but if you don't think he qualifies, just block your ears for a bit. Either way, he was clearly nowhere near his limit, setting 3 more records on the same day and bringing his time under 12 minutes by the end of the month. By mid-September, he had brought it all the way down to 11 minutes and 8 seconds, with a sub-11 minute game seemingly not far off. But this is as far as Sega Tetris skill can carry you. TJ would eke out an 11:06 about a month later, but by this point the ball was out of his hands. The September 20th edition of Gamist's High Score section contained 2 GM scores, an 11:39 and an 11:06.3, both of which were achieved by a player named Nov. Unfortunately, this is the only image I have of him. Is he mewing? Even if the 11:06 was achieved on the 20th, it still would have been the world record, but that's just the date that the times were collected by Gamist. The game could have happened at any point in the previous month. This will unfortunately be a recurring situation. Nov will set more records, but he didn't seem to ever share when he got them, so most of his times that we know today come from the monthly Gamist issues. If you are Nov, or know Nov, please contact me so we can remedy this tragedy. On October 22nd, TJ claimed to have achieved a 10:48, although this wasn't officially submitted for some undeclared reason. And he also claims that his time is just 1 second behind the world record, presumably by Nov, but this is not the time that would appear in Gamist 3 days later. Nobody else was improving at anywhere close to this speed. This was Nov's game now. It was shortly after this point that Nov recorded one of his runs, and although the quality is a bit crap, this is the oldest surviving footage of a TGM run, which means we can analyze it. Nov wastes almost no time having the pieces sit around. Almost every available frame is spent either moving a piece into position or soft dropping it, as you would expect. When going for time, trying to tuck pieces is a bad idea in the early levels, as soft dropping a piece onto the stack instantly locks it, meaning the only safe option is to get it close and then wait for the painfully slow gravity to move it the rest of the way. Nov starts by building up a well for Tetrises in the center of the board, an unusual strategy even for the time, and it leads to some moments where he has to cover the well in order to keep his stack clean. He makes up for these time losses by pushing his stack incredibly high in order to minimize soft dropping time, but having such a high stack puts you at risk of topping out if you get even 1 or 2 inopportune pieces. Nov pushes his luck massively in this game. I hope for his wallet's sake this wasn't how he played every game. He also ends up with a hole in his stack early on, misses some clear opportunities to fix it, and then lets it sit at the bottom until well past level 300. I don't understand that part. But he eventually decides to switch to a right side well, which serves him well going into 20G. This is where Nov's skill really shines. Despite the occasional misdrop, he demonstrates some very intelligent play, often intentionally setting up hanging pieces that he can tuck others into later. And although he begins to lose control of the board closing in on the end, he pulls through. Although this may not be the most polished speedrun out there, that mainly goes to show how difficult TGM really is, and how much of an achievement it is to even survive while playing at this speed. But Nov knew he could do better. By December he had broken the 10-minute barrier, 9:50 by January, then 9:40 by March. But once you're below 10 minutes, improving your time becomes extremely difficult. Back when the game first released, Mihara did some napkin math and predicted that 9:30 would be about the human limit. At this point it seemed pretty likely that Nov was going to break that barrier. The only question was how soon. He mentioned having gotten a 9:35 on June 1st, and the June 20th edition of Gamist showed his time at 9:34.41. However, this was not the best time on the list. A 9:31 had been submitted by a player named High7. Not much is known about them, but they had also been playing since the game's release, and they were a very strong player, so the first sub 9:30 could go either way. A week and a half later, it was announced that someone had broken the 9:30 barrier. That player was Nov. His exact time from this run wasn't mentioned when it happened, but by July 18th, his PB was stated to be a 9:24, and this may or may not have been from the same run. The day after, High7 fired back with a 9:23, which Nov had matched by August, but after this point things began to slow way down. By December the record was down to a 9:16, but High7 wasn't going for it anymore, and after this Nov wouldn't manage a new record for another 8 months. By this point TGM was nearly 2 years old, and unfortunately it didn't manage quite the same traction as Sega's Tetris. So not many people were still focused on bringing their times down, and even fewer had any chance of matching Nov's skill level, and Nov himself was playing less and less. The era was ending. Small side note, I did somewhat lie about Nov not sharing his records. He was posting them to an online high score page, but this page has no archives for most of his active period, because God hates me. If you were watching Nov and High7 at their peak, it'd be fair to assume that a sub 9-minute run might actually be possible. But as 2001 rolled around with nobody even close to breaking the record, the community began to wonder, was a sub 9 ever going to happen? Anyone going for it would have to be in it for the long haul. Remember, the skill doesn't just transfer from other games, you have to spend a lot of time playing TGM. But by 2001 there were 2 players up to the task who potentially had a shot at getting the record. The first was 777, or just 37, who was inspired to start playing by TJ shortly after the game's release. 37 was incredibly good at fast mental calculations, so it wasn't much of a surprise how quickly they were bringing their times down, having passed the 930 barrier in mid-2000. However, after their 924 they went nearly a year without a PB, and by the time they were making progress again, another top player by the name of MT wasn't far behind. In October, 37 regained second place and was now less than a second behind the world record. Then, right at the end of the year, Nov's record was finally dethroned by MT. Shortly after this, 37 got a 9:14.31, and they also claimed that they had seen a 9 minute 11 second time, which although they didn't say who, was presumably done by MT. In March they managed a 9:12, but shortly after, MT's time was made public. Or maybe this was a different run, I don't know. 37 got a run barely behind the record again, before finally taking the lead in June. At this point, MT felt he had reached his limit, so that left just 37 to see how far they could bring their time down. Let's see if they can hold the record long enough to break 9 minutes. Yeah, the current record really has stood for the past 15 years. And it's not for lack of trying. Not only have there been active top level players for that whole period, but 37 themselves has been playing nearly every day since the last record. To put into perspective just how good the current record is, when it happened no other player had achieved a sub 9. There were only 2 or 3 people who had even achieved a sub 910 at this point. 37 was so good they could consistently get sub 9 runs, but the 848 was insane even by their standards. It was both the fastest first half and the fastest second half they'd ever managed. When you've played thousands of games, the chance of that happening I don't normally believe in miracles, but this was not normal. It was also the biggest jump in the record since Nov's 916. Later on, 3.7 achieved an 849 and an 850, but they haven't managed times like those in years now. They really were at their limit. Even today, the second fastest player is still 7 seconds behind the record, with maybe a dozen people total who have achieved sub-9s. It is pretty damn rare to see a contested speedrun category dominated by one person, let alone one run, for so long. It's even more of a sight to see a run so unbelievably skilled that even 15 years later there is not a single person alive who can even come close to it. This run stands alone. We have gotten way ahead of ourselves though. Back in 1999, TGM was looking successful enough that Mihara had begun development of a port to the PlayStation. The game was always intended to be for consoles. It was already built on PlayStation-based arcade hardware, and promoting a game based on it being difficult to master kind of turns players away when they have to spend 50 or 100 yen for every run. Mihara probably chose to release an arcade game first because that's the environment he was familiar with developing for, and because an arcade license was cheaper and easier to get. Speaking of licensing, back in mid-1996, Henk and Alexei founded a new company to handle the licensing for Tetris games, fittingly named the Tetris Company. TTC then immediately ruined their reputation by sending out legal threats to anyone they could find who was sharing unlicensed Tetris clones, paid or not. Considering how ubiquitous Tetris is and how easy it is to code, this was a lot of people. Many of the victims of the Tetris intimidation simply changed the name of their games to avoid Tetris branding, at which point they would receive another email telling them they're still infringing on Tetris's look and feel. This was, and still is, a legal grey area, but none of the poor bedroom coders were about to take on a massive company in court, so most people just acquiesced and took down their games. You're probably thinking this is the same shit Nintendo does to intimidate its biggest fans into taking down their fan projects, and it's funny when you remember that Henk was BFFs with Nintendo's CEO, and their two companies would go on to collaborate many times. Clearly they were on the same wavelength. Henk actually responded to some guy's angry email about the takedowns, and they got into a huge fight. So what did co-owner Alexei have to say about all this? We have no idea. He was never a very public person, and if he did have an input on TTC's policies, he certainly wasn't announcing it, although I have a feeling he was just kind of there. Henk's level of control over TTC's decisions has also been a long-time topic of debate, but he's always seemed to be one of the major decision-making players, and as the company's figurehead, he was the guy you'd talk to if you wanted to make a deal. By March of '99, TGM's PlayStation port was apparently nearly done. However, negotiations with TTC to release it were suddenly grinding to a halt, with the release date indefinitely postponed. TTC's claimed reason for this was to adjust the Tetris market, although it wouldn't be clear exactly what this meant until Mihara put out an announcement at the end of May. It turned out TTC had just changed their Tetris policy to only license one game per platform going forward. This was bad news. There were already 3 versions of Tetris on the PlayStation, including one developed by Henk's other new company, Blue Planet Software. This meant that TGM could not get a PlayStation release. Eureka had no choice but to cancel it. They had also submitted a bid for a license to port the game to the upcoming PlayStation 2. But part of TTC's new policy was to wait for bids to come in from multiple companies, of which many already had, and then pick what they felt was likely to be the most profitable. TGM is a fantastic game, I love it, but it just doesn't have that broad, casual appeal that makes typical Tetris games so successful, and TTC's new policy meant they had no room for unique or niche Tetris games. In fact, despite their clear attempt not to dilute their brand with superfluous games, they were still perfectly perfectly happy to license boring slop, and many big companies were more than happy to pay top dollar to develop boring slop because they knew it would sell no matter what. I mean, it's Tetris. TGM was a moderately successful but abnormal game created by a small company, so whether TTC's decision was based on the upfront bid or projected sales figures, Mihara likely knew before he even heard back that their bid for the PS2 was going to be denied. Opening up the game's code also gives us hints that it may have been intended for a later international arcade release, although for reasons unclear this also never happened. Thus, the Western world was doomed to remain almost completely unaware of the game's existence. However, the cancellation didn't mean people weren't playing TGM at home. Sort of. Not long after the game's release, a player by the name of Goo began work on a fan recreation for the PC. It was designed to mimic the gameplay of the original TGM as closely as possible, but it had to be done using the limited information the community had at the time, meaning it deviates from the original in small ways. However, it also adds some features not in TGM, such as a detailed statistics display, which made it a very useful training tool. The benefit of a game like this for players at the time was twofold. It allowed people who didn't live in close range of a TGM cabinet to still play the game without having to make a long trip, and it also allowed players to practice and play a TGM-like game without having to go to the arcade to spend money. The game was called GTAT, and it went public around January of '99, mainly keeping a low profile as most opted to discuss it privately rather than on public message boards. In fact, many message boards at the time had strict rules not to discuss any unofficial clones of TGM. This was fair, as we're well aware TTC was incredibly tough on fan-made games at the time, and having a bunch of people playing clones of TGM would likely make things more difficult if Eureka wanted to secure a license for another Tetris game in the future. And of course, the letting players play without spending money aspect obviously raises concerns. If Eureka couldn't get a license to port TGM to home consoles, it's fair to assume that the convenience of unofficial PC clones might draw away players that would otherwise put their money into the official cabinets. Despite all this, Mihara actually didn't mind GTAT. It did have original features and original graphics, at the time at least, and it was mostly flying under the radar, so he never actually asked for the site to be taken down. For the moment, GTAT would remain. Wow, that image comes up a lot. I do not have many images. The TGM National Tournament, officially called the Eureka Mihara Presents Tetris the Grandmaster Time Attack Tournament, was the largest meetup of top TGM talent since the game's release. It was mainly organized by Mihara, with help from a player named Ipe Papi, who was also the owner of one of the largest community forums. Over the afternoon of December 30th, 1999, a total of 15 people went head-to-head to decide once and for all the best TGM players of the 20th century. Although, despite this frequently being called the World Tournament, nobody outside of Japan played TGM at this point. Many of these participants are people we've met previously, as well as a smaller community member who will grow to prominence later on. The plan was to split the tournament into two sections, a time attack division and a battle division. The goal of the time attack division was simply to see who could reach a certain level the fastest. 200 for qualifiers, 500 $200 for quarterfinals and $9.99 for the semifinals and the finals. However, nerves turned out to be a recurring problem. Players who could normally get consistent GMs were now struggling to even reach level 200 before topping out, either because they made a series of poor decisions or because they were making extremely risky moves to go as fast as possible. Nov faced Ipe Papi in the quarterfinals, and since Nov's average GM game was over 30 seconds faster than his opponent, he had every reason to play it safe. But the outwardly carefree Nov was secretly facing nerves as bad as everyone else, which led to him topping out before he even reached 500. The best player in the room had lost without even reaching the semi-finals. So the finals ended up being between Ipe Papi and a player named Jin, who had recently broken 10 minutes and was known for his consistency. Consistency that immediately imploded under the stress of the AMPTTGMTAT, as Jin also topped out early, leaving Ipe Papi the unexpected winner of the time attack division. Then the battle division began. With less emphasis on risk-taking, Nov regained control and breezed through the competition, leading to an easy victory. After the battle division, there was still some time left for the tournament, so it was spontaneously decided to run a second time attack division. This was intended to remedy the obvious issue that plagued the first division, which is that Nov didn't win. This time Zon faced 3-7 in the quarterfinals, and the match was so close that the person filming the event had to play it back to see who finished first. Zon won by half a second, and went on to battle a lesser known player by the name of Arnie in the semi-finals. Arnie then advanced to the finals, where Nov wiped the floor with him. Overall, it was a success. In fact, the community ended up enjoying the national tournament so much that they decided to host another one 4 months later. This second tournament was called the TGM Olympics, and despite not being hosted by Arika, it ended up with 20 participants, even more than the first tournament. Keep in mind that this tournament occurred at this point, and although High7 hadn't held the record in a while, he was still considered roughly equal in skill with Nov. Thus, the hype went through the roof when High7 confirmed that he would be attending this time around. The general skill level of the other players had also increased since December, and in a shocking upset, Nov didn't even make it to the semi-finals. In fact, High7 won the tournament. At this point, a large portion of the top TGM players lived in roughly the same area, forming a group colloquially known as the Ofuna Squad. This group consisted of Zon, Ipe Papi, 3-7, Jin, and a player named Kuroda. On the night of May the 3rd, these 5 players were in a car together, headed to Nagoya for the TGM Olympics the next day. Among the variety of topics discussed on this trip, the upcoming tournament, traffic, and so on, was the one question that every TGM fan had asked in the past few days. What does TA stand for? Sonan Arika was a serialized comic segment that appeared bi-monthly in Gamist starting in early 1998. The comic was effectively promotional material for Arika, dramatizing day-to-day events at their office and the development of their games. But Mihara's goofy little cartoon character was easily the most memorable. He's frequently seen shouting, annoying people, and generally being eccentric. This is how most people knew Mihara at the time. A gremlin. And that was intentional. Mihara has stated himself that his intense and eccentric personality in Sonan Arika was actually how he acted in real life, although it was mainly an act in order to make him more memorable. After Arika's initial formation and Mihara's sudden thrust into the responsibilities of vice president, he and Akira both realized that if they wanted to get into rooms with gaming industry executives, they had to put themselves out there. Akira started a personal column called Akira Does His Best, and Mihara got Sonan Arika. The comics were also frequently used as a conduit to announce things Arika was working on, and the May 1st edition of Arcadia, the successor to Gamist, featured Mihara's character officially announcing that a sequel to TGM was in development, and its subtitle was TA. Mihara had no plans to reveal what that stood for anytime soon, so the community was left to make all sorts of guesses. But gradually, more information was coming out. A public beta test in June, an interview in July, a convention booth in August where you could battle Arika's resident master. And images were starting to appear as well, with a new, more mechanical look. This game was harder. It had more modes, faster speeds, and new grades. The game released in October of 2000, and it was called Tetris the Grandmaster 2: The Absolute.